Here with us for our leadoff discussion on a back-to-work Monday night, Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, Jill Colvin, White House reporter for the Associated Press, and Philip Rucker, Pulitzer Prize-winning White House bureau chief for the Washington Post, who happens to be co-author with his Post colleague Carol Leonnig of the new book, A Very Stable Genius, Donald J. Trump's Testing of America, which is due out a week from tomorrow, and something tells me we'll be discussing it along the way. Hey, Peter Baker, we'll begin with you tonight. Your newspaper and reporting since matched by Philip's newspaper. This Russia story about Russia attempting to hack into Burisma. When people portray this as a second Russian attempt to assist Donald Trump, will that portrayal be accurate?
Well, we don't know for a fact what it is they were trying to do. We don't know for a fact what they were necessarily trying to get out of these computers from Burisma, but it is certainly a logical suspicion to wonder whether or not they were looking for some of the same information that Donald Trump had been asking the Ukrainian government to come up with, which is to say information that would, in fact, incriminate the Bidens in some way or another. What the timing of it, the scope of it, the target, they're all too much to be a coincidence. This happened, as you point out earlier, starting in November at the time, and there was a great deal of focus and intention on this here in Washington. So it begs the question, what were the Russians up to? This is the same units, GRU, the military intelligence that had been involved with the election interference back in 2016. And it doesn't sound like it should be seen as a coincidence that suddenly they're looking at this otherwise pretty obscure Ukrainian company.
Hey, Jill, as no one needs to remind you, the president enjoys taking the previously unimaginable and then owning it. Sometimes minutes later, he publicly requested that China look into Burisma on the South Lawn of the White House, if I recall. It often can normalize, again, a previously outlandish topic. So what's the chance he will welcome Russian intervention in Burisma?
I mean, I certainly wouldn't be surprised, be heading with the president tomorrow for another rally, and I would not be surprised at all if he were to do that kind of thing, calling for, endorsing at least the idea that this company should be investigating, potentially suggesting that there are emails or other documents that might be of interest to him. But of course, the president has also been very careful over the years to try to distance himself, of course, from any allegations of Russian election meddling or Russian meddling in any of these processes, because he still feels like they are an attack on the legitimacy of his presidency. So it's still a difficult kind of thread that he has, or needle that he has to thread here.
And Phil Rucker, you've written tonight about a credibility crisis that we can state in plain English. No one seems to know where the president got that bit about 4 of our embassies being potentially targeted.
That's right, Brian. At the Pentagon and elsewhere in the government, there are no answers. There's no evidence to back up the president's claim that he made last Friday with Fox News Channel that there were threats of attacks on 4 U.S. embassies. He said he believed that there were threats on those embassies. And so that leaves the listener to wonder, was he conveying actual intelligence that he'd received and studied and analyzed? Or was he conveying his own personal belief, his own theory about what might have happened? But based on the information that we know right now, what the president said about 4 embassies was either an unfounded theory or an outright fabrication. And it is up to the administration now to come forward with some more information to either support his claim or explain where he might have heard that from.
Peter Baker, someone we both know, Mike McFaul, former U.S. ambassador to Moscow, has written an op-ed in the Washington Post warning about a Russian disinformation campaign, Russians and elsewhere, I suppose, during the impeachment trial. As a veteran of impeachment trials, can you imagine Russian fomentation on top of the bile that it normally surrounds the partisan debate of an impeachment trial?
Well, there's a lot of things we couldn't imagine not too long ago that now seem to be kind of normal, as you pointed out earlier, and that would be another example of that. The Russians trying to find a way to stir the pot, even as the American system is debating basically the most fundamental question under our Constitution, whether a president is fit for office and should continue to the end of his term. It wouldn't surprise us, given what we've seen, obviously, in the last few years. It's possible that the story that my colleagues had tonight and the Post-match on the Russian, hacking of Burisma was in preparation for some sort of, disinformation campaign. We don't know that. I want to be careful. We're going too far, but it's something, as Ambassador McFaul is saying, something to be prepared for, because they have made very clear, the Russians have, that they are willing to do what they can to disrupt our faith in democracy, our understanding of facts, to spin out wild and unfounded conspiracy theories just to disrupt us. And that's the goal that Vladimir Putin started off with, I think, way back in 2014-15 when they got going with this election campaign, and they're still at it.
Jill Colvin, what do you imagine it's like to be Mitch McConnell right about now?
Well, Mitch McConnell, of course, has a tremendous amount of power here, and somebody the president is relying on very closely as we move into the next phase and we start to learn what exactly the Senate trial is going to look like. Look, throughout this process, McConnell has been trying to convince the president that it is not a good idea to have a long, drawn-out trial, that even though the president would like to see a parade of witnesses, would love to see Hunter Biden up there, would love to see, Joe Biden up there, would love to see Adam Schiff up there, that's actually not in the best interest of the president or the Republican Party. The president has sort of gone back and forth on that question. And we even saw over the last couple of days this idea that the White House and allies of the president floated of potentially just having an outright dismissal, not even really beginning a trial. It seemed today from senators as they returned to the Capitol today that there is not enough support for just a dismissal. It seems like there is some interest, certainly, in calling witnesses, but they'd like to see that happen later on. But it's up to Mitch McConnell now to try to keep Republicans in line and to try to keep the party together throughout this process.
Hey, Phil Rucker, I want to read a tweet from one of your colleagues. Aaron Blake wrote this: before 11 a.m., this is today, Trump has tweeted 4 typos, including Bernie Sanders, Pocahontas, and we'll let you read that. I'm not going to, I guess, radical and eminent. He has retweeted a photoshopped image of Schumer and Pelosi in Muslim garb. He retweeted an image of a corpse. He tweeted several false claims about GOP and health care and tweeted about Bloomberg's height. Phil, given that the title of your forthcoming book is A Very Stable Genius, are serious people right about now asking serious questions about his stability?
It's a good question, Brian. First of all, that title is the president's own words. That is what he has called himself numerous times, a very stable genius. And throughout these 3 years of the presidency, people who've been observing this president closely have had concerns about his stability. We see with his tweeting pattern, with his social media pattern, that whenever he feels under siege, as he is right now, having been impeached by the House of Representatives and about to stand trial in the Senate for possible removal from office, he is threatened, he is under siege, he's on the defensive, and you're seeing him lash out. And he does so on Twitter. You're going to probably see that tomorrow night at that rally when Jill goes up to Milwaukee with the president. And it may be a shaky few weeks to come as this trial gets underway.
It'll all be interesting. We'll be here for all of it. And thanks to our 3 friends for joining us tonight.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.